The man stretched his arm out of the train window. 7 minutes later, his entire arm had frozen into an ice sculpture. The man in the suit tapped it lightly, producing a crisp sound, then grabbed a large iron hammer, swung it, and smashed it down. The people below didn't dare make a sound. After all, he had only thrown a shoe at a wealthy person, and yet he faced such torture. In the future, to combat the worsening greenhouse effect, countries around the world launched a freezing machine codenamed CW7. The plan was to lower global temperatures to a controllable range, but it unexpectedly triggered a series of chain reactions, plunging the Earth into an ice age. Most people froze to death, while the survivors took refuge on a massive, perpetually moving train that circled the globe. By now, it had been running for 17 years. Inside, people were divided into classes. The wealthy rode at the front, eating steak and partying daily. The middle class served as enforcers and soldiers in the middle cars, and the poor, who had no ticket but managed to sneak on, were subjected to brutal control in the rear cars. The space was cramped, the air thick with body odor, sweat, and the stench of decay, and every day they could only eat blackish protein blocks. On top of that, the front would send people to kidnap children, and any resistance was met with torture, like the man who had thrown the shoe. Such continuous oppression naturally led to rebellion among the rear car's poor, and Chris was their leader. For years, they had been collecting iron barrels, preparing for the moment they could break through the front gates. Everything was ready. They just needed the right opportunity. One day, while everyone was lined up for food as usual, 3 electric gates at the front unexpectedly opened simultaneously. Chris knew the time had come. He dropped his protein block, rushed through the crowd toward the soldiers, grabbed a soldier's gun, and pulled the trigger. It turned out the bullets had already been used up 4 years ago during a suppressed uprising. Chris had gambled correctly. Receiving the signal, the others lifted iron barrels and pushed them forward to block the carriage doors. Chris led the charge, engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the soldiers. The crowd surged forward, quickly overwhelming the frontline soldiers. But the soldiers were tough opponents. One large, bald soldier swung a massive iron block back and forth, and the rebels couldn't handle him. At that moment, a young man took off his jacket, accelerated, leapt onto the bald soldier, and drove a knife into his heart. They also obtained the prison keys. Chris's next plan was to rescue the safety expert Jillian from the train prison. Jillian knew how to open the electric train doors. The train prison consisted of cabinet-like cells, and as expected, the prisoner Jillian was inside. But he wouldn't help for free. His daughter had to come along, and opening each door cost 2 chronos. Jillian's daughter Yuna had a special skill. Her ears were so sharp she could hear how many people were behind each door. Using her ability, they opened the first prison door. This carriage had previously housed soldiers, but it was now empty. For the first time in 17 years, the oppressed rear car passengers saw the outside world. Sunlight touched their faces for the first time, and the world outside looked just like it had before they boarded, still covered in ice and snow. Next, they moved to the following carriage, where protein blocks were mass-produced. Despite eating these blocks for 17 years, no one knew what they were made of. Climbing to the top of the machinery, Chris was shocked when he saw the raw materials. For 17 years, the poor had been eating protein blocks every day, but Chris was shocked to discover that these blocks were made from tens of thousands of cockroaches. Staring at the pot full of roaches, he bit his fist in disgust, nearly vomiting. Below, the others were greedily eating the protein blocks, completely unaware of the truth. Chris decided not to tell them and continued forward. Jillian began unlocking the door, and at that moment, Yuna seemed to sense some kind of danger. But it was too late. The door opened, revealing a large group of burly men wearing masks and wielding axes. With no bullets, everyone reverted to using melee weapons. The burly men taunted the poor, arrogantly presenting a fish, passing it from one to another, cutting it in turn, their axes dripping with blood as they charged forward. The poor were not afraid and didn't hesitate. They directly fought back. The train passed the starting bridge, marking the end of 17 years and the arrival of a new year. Everyone instinctively stopped fighting. At that moment, the wealthy steward Mason appeared, berating the poor for being ungrateful. She argued that when the train leader Wilf had allowed these ticketless civilians aboard, it had already been an act of great mercy. How dare they ask for more and openly rebel, turning their blades against the rulers? She then ordered a massacre. Chris was furious. He hurled an axe, shouting, "This is nonsense. You treat us like slaves and forbid us to resist. How is this acceptable?" Surprisingly, Mason didn't explode in anger. Instead, she picked up a telescope and sneered at them. The burly men put on night vision goggles. Disaster had struck. Once the train entered the tunnel past the bridge, all the poor became sitting ducks. At this critical moment, a child at the rear grabbed a box of matches. Amid calls from everyone, he lit a torch and began passing it forward, from child to youth, youth to adult, running tirelessly. A tiny spark can set a prairie ablaze. Soon the torch reached the battlefield. The poor turned the tide. Just as in Greek mythology, where Prometheus brought fire to humanity, here fire brought victory to the poor. Before Mason could react, an axe axe struck her leg. Chris seized her, forcing her to give the order to cease fighting. As the train exited the tunnel, Chris mourned the death of his best friend and resolved to press on. He threatened Mason to lead them to the next cars. To save her own life, Mason complied. To prevent further bloodshed, Chris formed a squad to move forward while the rest stayed behind to recover. Indeed, under Mason's guidance, no one attempted further violence. The next car was the greenhouse section. Everyone was awestruck. Fruit trees lined both sides, flowers bloomed everywhere, and people were tending various fruits and vegetables. Moving on to the next car, they found an aquarium. Besides the ornamental fish, there were chefs preparing sushi for the wealthy. For the first time in over a decade, those at the rear tasted something other than protein blocks. The farther the train moved forward, the more luxurious it became, but also the more corrupt. At the rear, the poor had no food, no clothes, and no way to bathe, while at the front, the wealthy drank and danced all day, enjoying salons, dentists, tailors, everything imaginable. At that moment, the rich passengers, unaware of what was happening, cautiously watched the intruders. None dared make a move. It was ironic, but Chris didn't intend to bother them. His target was Wilford. Soon they reached the sauna, and the soldiers caught up with them. There, the young men and the soldiers died together. Tanya, searching for her child, was gravely injured and barely clinging to life. She begged Chris to survive and find her child. Now, only Chris, Jillian, and Yona remained alive. They successfully reached the front car, and this time, there were no pursuers. The door to the head car stood silently before them, yet Jillian stubbornly refused to open it. Jillian had his own plan. He wanted to open a different door leading outside. Chris thought he'd lost his mind. Leaving the train would mean freezing to death, but Jillian disagreed. He had noticed the snow line outside slowly descending. Every time the train crossed a bridge, Jillian secretly observed the wreckage of crashed planes. Over the past few years, the snow covering them had begun to melt. Previously invisible tail sections were now fully exposed. Ice and snow were thinning, and the snowfall itself had grown sparse. Temperatures were rising. Jillian had deliberately made himself look like a drug addict to gather Kronos, a discarded industrial material that was highly flammable and explosive. As he explained this, he bundled the Kronos together to blow open the door. Then we can get outside. Nature is where we belong, he said. At that moment, Wilford's door opened. One of his men shot Jillian, then invited Chris inside. Finally, Chris came face to face with the train's master, Wilford. To Chris's surprise, Wilford wasn't the utterly evil man he had imagined. Instead, he smiled, invited Chris to a meal, and even mixed him a drink with ice. Wilford explained that for the train to keep running, population and food supplies needed to remain balanced. Only by maintaining the optimal conditions could coexistence continue. Otherwise, the train wouldn't have moved for 18 years. The only way to reduce the population without error was to incite a revolt, which required cooperation between the front and rear cars. The informant at the rear was none other than Chris's most respected mentor. No wonder every past revolt had been perfectly orchestrated with Wilford, but this time, Wilford deemed the mentor too old and killed him. Wilford then brought Chris to the perpetual motion machine, intending for him to inherit the head car's position. The train needed someone stronger to maintain balance so everyone could survive. Chris's worldview collapsed. Looking at the machine and the potential wealth, he felt tempted. Then Yona burst through the door. She had heard a child beneath the floor. They opened the panel and found Tanya's child and the one-armed man operating the damaged components. Chris's shouts went unanswered, but he snapped back to reality. He jammed his arm into the gears to rescue the child and handed the last matches to Yona. Since the perpetual motion machine relied on harming children to function, Yona decided it was better to destroy it. She ignited the explosives. At the moment of the blast, Jillian and Chris shielded Yona and the child. In the end, everyone else on the train perished. Only Tanya's child and Yona survived. They stepped out into the fresh air. Looking ahead, Yona spotted a polar bear nearby, a clear sign that the Earth's climate had finally become suitable for life.